So when we're talking about altered states, and I would say all meditational practices involve altered states. So when people say they have their brain waves measured because they're in these various levels of meditation, I would say they're all to do with altered states. So if you take psychedelics or you do astral travel and you experience all these different things, I would say that isn't meditation. And because Krishnamurti did contextualize in one sense his ideas of cosmic consciousness going to the source of creation, that means he was still within the field of consciousness extended in the psyche as an altered state. So you might say he might have gone to the threshold of the one, but not actually acknowledged the one. So you could say in another way, the scientist is exploring the quantum field, and then people talk about the unified field theory as being the source of consciousness, that the unified field theory is synonymous with consciousness. And in Professor David Boehm's Implicate Order, he's saying that the psyche and the physical aspects come out of an implicate order. And Jung says the psychic and the physical come out of the collective unconscious, as it were. So I'm saying these ideas are going to the threshold of the one. So they're not really about self and the one. And this idea of non-self is the ignorance of not knowing self as one. That is really, I think, the root of the problem. That to me, knowing the self is knowing the one. Not knowing the self and not knowing the one, then you're going to have a problem with, you might say, dissociated senses of identity. So in mental illness, schizophrenia, there's all kinds of split personalities. In Jungian psychology, he calls those complexes. So when he was studying his cousin, a medium, this woman who was a medium, she would go into a trance and she would behave as if she was a very superior person, and she seemed to have incredible knowledge about things. And a lot of mediums, they take on certain personalities and thought forms, so they think they might think they're a spiritual teacher, or they might think they're godlike, or they might think that they're a philosopher or somebody from the past, delusions of grandeur. And I'm saying that in the Christian tradition, when you imitate Christ, a Christian will want to be like Christ, a Buddhist will want to be like Buddha, and they go into these different levels and they aspire to go into these higher levels and the higher self and everything like that. But all of that is self-deception, all of that is a misconception, and in a sense it's irrelevant. That type of relationship is irrelevant, because self is self and one is one. And there's no need to go through all of that projection of your identity, because really it's all a projection of the ego identity. And so you think going into the one, going into nirvana, going into God, you've got to get rid of yourself. You've got to get rid of yourself. But really, what that actually means is you have to die to your ego. You've got to die to the identity of the meditator. Die to the identity of being a spiritual person. Die to the identity of being identified with Christ and Buddha and God and the One. So I think this is the area where there's a problem with the non-self idea. But if you have direct experience of the one, then you realise one and self are synonymous, and that's basically what I get from reading the Tibetan text. And of course, in the end, only you can validate your own freedom. Only you can validate your own realization. No one can validate that for you. So I guess it's a personal assessment whether the person you're identifying with is a spiritual teacher, is self-aware, and is communicating the right kind of information or knowledge or understanding. So to me, Krishnamurti definitely taught the idea of non-self, and certainly taught that to the students at the school. See, from my point of view, as self, there can be no teaching from the point of view of self. It's just simply freedom. And from that level, there's no need to do anything. There's no need to become anything. There's no need to be responsible for anything, for other people or whatever. However, when you do become responsible, when you do care about the world, when you do care about whether it's nature or other people and the fate of humanity, etc., then you can take on the role of what they call the Buddhas of meditation, or the Bodhisattva. And so you might say the self in the one, which is freedom, isn't necessarily compromised by taking on the role of, say, a bodhisattva, for example. It's I think, something that happens in a creative way, and is like fine-tuned. It's like fine-tuned to the one. It's fine-tuned to synchronicity. And you could say that the way the bodhisattva operates, the spiritual teacher, the bodhisattva, which is an aspect of the one, as it were, or oneself, whether in this world or acting from another dimension, that the way you might say that operates in the world is through the level of communion. So there's like a synchronistic communion between yourself and others, and that communion is a transmission which is understood to be a gift. So they call that transmission gift waves or grace waves. So it's a very benign transmission. it's a transmission of wisdom, and that wisdom, I would say, connects to your soul essence. So a person, say, that becomes interested in spirituality, or even before becoming interested in spirituality, has an awakening. So the awakening happens, and you're in touch with yourself. From that moment on, you're actually integral to the Buddhas of meditation, to the Bodhisattvas. So already you are that. And you're learning to grow in intelligence, grow in love, grow in beauty. So in a sense, your soul essence, like a flower, and they often use the idea of the lotus, and in Chinese alchemy, the golden flower. So you might say, as a symbol within your psyche, then you're nourishing and cultivating the golden flower, and the perfume of the golden flower is the wisdom that will inform you as to how to, you might say, transmit wisdom. Now, if upon awakening the self is in the one, and at the same time you're in the world, you're acting in the world creatively as a bodhisattva, for example, or the Buddhas of meditation, then you are spontaneously, creatively growing in that light of understanding. And you're not nourished from consciousness, you're not nourished from the psyche or the physical. You're not nourished in that way. So you could say there's a kind of entelechy, which means it's a kind of self-creative process. It's a self-generating process. So like the one, which is inexhaustible, so you might say the meditation of the seer in the one becomes the seeing of the Buddhas of meditation, and that seeing is realizing your Buddha nature, your Bodhisattva nature, which might be the incarnation of love or the incarnation of beauty in your soul essence, as it were. And what you don't do, which is what consciousness and ego does, you don't look for results, you don't look for effects in the world, you don't look for followers, you don't look for numbers of people that you can convert, you don't organize anything, you don't, in the sense of, you might say, a kind of power structure or manipulating other people's minds and that kind of thing. So in the life of the Buddha, they say that when he was enlightened, he met up with his family and some old friends that he was with before, ascetics in the forest, as it were, and evidently he seems to have enlightened one of his old friends and his cousin Ananda. And he did that by holding up a flower. So in holding up a flower, could have been the lotus, for example, or whatever. And so if you take the flower to be the symbol of life itself, it's a symbol, so it's not in the one, it's not Buddha in transcendence out of his body, but it's Buddha incarnate as a spiritual teacher. So he's revealing the life force as it manifests as the Bodhisattva, or an aspect of the Buddha like love and truth and beauty. So that symbol, that revelation must have brought about a synchronistic communion with that particular person, so they became enlightened in some way. And because that symbol is part of the one, in the sense of it's an aspect, an attribute of the Buddha, then it would have the power to enlighten. It would have the power, as it were, to transmit into the mind in meditation. So you assume that his cousin and friend were in meditation, and therefore they were receptive. So that means if you're awakened, which means you're in meditation, you're in the one, and you need a revelation. You need a revelation. So in a sense, when you're awakened, that means you must be in synchronistic rapport with the one. And it's the one, you might say, becoming self-aware is the one enlightening itself, as it were. And then, in that meditation, you, in the world, you realize the self in meditation, or the seer seeing, you realize the nature of the Buddha as an incarnation of love or beauty or truth. So I would say they go together. The flower and the one go together. The flower, as the Buddha nature or aspect of the Buddha, is a symbol of enlightenment. So the seer seeing and the self in meditation is like, you might say, a reflection in the mirror. So they refer to one of the Buddhas, the Buddha natures, as the mirror-like wisdom. So you could say, in effect, the flower mirrors to that other mind, as it were, of the recipient. It mirrors back to them. It mirrors their own enlightenment. It mirrors their own incarnation. I mean, if you're a scientist and somebody hands you a piece of paper with a formula on, you immediately see that. And if you've never seen that formula, it will just awaken you to what it is. If you're a scientist and you're ready for that information, then they hand you a formula, then you're awakened to that. So a creative person, say like Einstein, he received in his mind the theory of relativity, and then after him, the people that studied him had a creative leap. As a quantum physicist, they discovered the quantum field, Niels Bohr. And that's a kind of transmission, you could say, from master to master or teacher to teacher. I mean, one of the Buddhas holds the Book of Wisdom, for example. So you could have a vision or a dream or vision, and maybe you're shown the Book of Wisdom. And in some way, that revelation connects with you synchronistically and awakens you in some way. And as the months and years go by, as happened to me, it took till I was about 35 before I started to, you might say, crystallize the kind of knowledge I was meant to know, the kind of nature or the kind of understanding I was meant to grasp, you know, in the sense of, you say, incarnation of truth. So when I started having synchronicities and then I was reading Jung, reading Carl Jung, then that was something that was meant to be, because I needed to understand that principle. I needed to live that kind of life as my karma, as my life story. And that was the way I could have my life review years later and work through my life review. So I mean, you could be a musician and you've got to kind of work through that process. You could be an artist, but you could be in any walk of life. You've got to work through your karma. You've got to work through what you're given. I mean, if you're born into poverty, you've got to work through that. If you're born as a rich person, you've got to work through that. It shouldn't make any difference. It's all going on in the field of consciousness and the world, which is a product of consciousness, and get on with what you're given. Don't look, don't compare, don't judge, just get on with what is given to you.